Hi folks, I just wanted to take a little bit of time today to show you some of the pieces from the Kickstarter a little more closely, and specifically talk about how to prepare the pieces and what needs to be done to paint them as well, to show you the process that I've gone through to paint the pieces that I used as examples for the Kickstarter. I cast all of my pieces in open face molds. So part of what that means is that when they come to you, they'll require some cleanup. Part of it, you can see here on the back side of this piece, there are some bubbles, and sometimes there are some extra pieces of resin there that can be broken off either by hand, or sometimes the edges will need to be cleaned up with a hobby knife. In order to take care of the bubbles on this side, they shouldn't affect whether or not it lays flat or not, or how it works in regards to gameplay. But what I like to do is to take some sandpaper and then just give the back a light rub to flatten everything out. And as you can see, the bubbles are still there, but they no longer rise up from the back of it. Most of the pieces in this Kickstarter don't require any sort of assembly. Rather, they're made to go together and come apart easily to make the terrain more accessible during gameplay. The one exception to this is the temple arch. The temple arch comes in 7 pieces, and I recommend, because it can become somewhat top-heavy, gluing together the main arch itself and still leaving it separate from the base so you can put it on and take it off as needed. But to glue these pieces together initially. The first thing you want to do is prepare everything like we discussed them before. Sand the bottoms, trim any edges. Trimming the edges can be especially important along the bases of the pillars because you want to make sure that they fit neatly into the recesses that are made for them. Once you've done that, the next thing to do is to glue these 2 pieces together. And that creates the flat top of the arch. And then you can glue the pillars together. The pillars are made to slide together, like so. So some glue and maybe some green stuff or epoxy putty in there can help make it a good seal. And then I also recommend that you glue the pillars themselves into the top of the arch. That way you'll have the arch as one solid piece, like this, that you can then put in and take out as needed. In regards to primer, I'm a big fan of Krylon primer, though honestly what I usually end up getting is whatever's cheapest at the hardware store at any given time. Any flat black spray paint that's listed as primer should work fine. This is one of the pieces of scatter terrain that's already been primed with the Krylon Color Master. In order to paint these, I like to use Delta Ceramcoat for my paint. It's usually a couple dollars per 2 ounces or so at any kind of craft store. I like the Ceramcoat because it has pretty good coverage, though you could probably get away with using any kind of inexpensive craft paint. The colors I'll be using are, for the stone itself, I'll be using Hippo Gray and White in various mixtures to do that. Of course, if you don't want gray stone, if you want brown stone, or if you want sandstone, or that sort of thing, you could use different colors for the stone. For the dirt areas, I'll be using a base of burnt umber, followed by autumn brown, followed by trail tan. I like to use a number 12 flat brush. It's just a regular acrylic brush in order to paint my terrain, though I've done plenty of it with just an inexpensive chip brush as well. I'm starting with some Hippo Gray here, and I'm getting a fair amount on the brush, and I want to end up brushing a fair bit of it off. The point here isn't to dry brush, rather it's to make sure that you're not just soaking the paintbrush so that you're just slobbing the paint on in all the cracks. I'm going to use a technique similar to dry brushing, where I'm going to go ahead and lightly rub over the top of the terrain piece, over the top of the stonework, with the idea being I want to get the paint on the upper surface of it and not down in the crevices. And here I'm not being careful about where I put it, about where anything goes. I'm just getting it kind of all over the place. Sometimes you need to get a little more paint. And you get a feel for this pretty quickly, how much paint it takes to be able to do a good job of this. There we go. So that's the first coat of gray, and you can see already a lot of the detail on the pieces are starting to show up, a lot of the detail on the resin. Typically when you're painting terrain, you batch paint. So what I would then do is set this piece aside and then move on and paint more of the first layer of gray on another piece, and keep doing that so that by the time I come back around to this piece, it would have dried already and it would be ready for the next layer. That way you don't have to pause at all in between times waiting for things to dry. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to pause things for a little bit and then I'll come back as soon as this is dry. I will say that acrylic paint dries fairly quickly. The first coat has had a little bit of time to dry. If it's not quite light enough to your liking, sometimes you can go back through and kind of touch things up and add a little bit more. With the Ceram coat, you get a pretty even coverage, so I'm pretty happy with the way things are now. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit of white to the mixture. And when I'm painting, when I'm painting terrain, I tend to just go ahead and mix on the brush itself, and it's okay if it's inconsistent. So what I've got there is about half gray and half white, and then I'm going to mix that around there, a little more white. I want that a little bit lighter. This is going to be the first of the highlight colors. So now I take it, and here I want a little bit less paint on the brush than I had the first time. And I'm going to go through and more lightly hit these pieces. Again, this is really similar to dry brushing. Say that you have more paint on the brush than you would when you were dry brushing. It's similar in that as I go through each successive highlight, I'm going to put less and less paint on and do it lighter and lighter. Make my brush strokes lighter and lighter. That way, as we go through, it will end up creating the highlights and that sort of thing. You can see it starting to come out more and more already. And that's it with that piece, with that layer. I would, again, normally move on then to the next piece while this piece dried. But I'll go ahead and pause it now, and then I'll come back with an additional layer. Now that the second layer of gray is dry, I'm going to do it again, but this time use a lot more white than I do gray. So the idea here is to get the shades lighter and lighter. I like to oftentimes mix on a piece of paper or something like that so I can see the colors in contrast to one another to make sure that I'm getting things the right shade. Here I want it a lot drier than it was before, the brush a lot drier, and when I do my brush strokes I'm going to do them a lot more lightly. And with these lighter shades, you should really see a lot of the detail of the stonework and the resin come alive. I'm not being careful about whether or not I get things on the dirt down there. If your terrain is mostly one color, then when you initially do it, you don't have to stay between the lines. In fact, a little bit of kind of overage where it comes down onto the rubble down there is actually kind of helpful. So it's up to you how many layers you put on these, and these lighter layers dry a lot more quickly than the initial heavy layers do as well. I tend to go pretty cartoony and contrasty with pretty much everything I paint, so I usually like to even go in at the end here and do one that's almost pure white, and just really lightly to really make it pop and stand out. But if you prefer a more realistic way of looking at things or of painting your terrain, then you might choose to stop whenever things look good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and, just because it's the way I usually do things, add a little more white. And I'm going to clean off some of the gray off the brush, charge it with white, and then hit it one more time. Again, this time I'm trying to do it very lightly. And not very much paint on the brush at all. You could get into eventually true dry brushing if you wanted to. That's too much paint. Alright, that's good enough for me. Next, I'll show you how to do the brown. In order to paint the brown, I'm going to come in with a beat up, flat, looks like about maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch brush. Don't use good paintbrushes for terrain painting unless if you're just kind of slopping things on like this. I've got some burnt umber over here, so I'm going to put it on pretty thick on my brush. And then I'm just going to go through and try to hit up the places where the dirt should be showing through and paint that brown. Here I'm putting it on pretty thick. I'm letting it get into the crevices, though with everything primed black I don't have to worry about it if it doesn't get all the way down in the nooks and crannies. They'll just be shaded darker. This brush that I'm using is actually a little bit too beat up for this job. I'd like to use a little bit bigger brush. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the big chisel brush, or I'm sorry, to the big flat brush that I use for the rest of things, just to make it go quicker. With terrain painting, you can always lavish a bunch of time over each piece if you want to, but really I've found that one of the satisfying things about painting terrain is that you get a lot accomplished in a short amount of time. So I'm always looking for opportunities to make shortcuts, to make things go quicker and that kind of thing. So sometimes I get paint on the model itself. Oops. At this point, if it's still wet, I can wipe it off. Though if it leaves a little brown in the recess, we'll just call that weathering. Once I've got those big areas around the edges all worked out and dark brown, I'm going to go back in with a smaller brush and get some of these areas down here between the rubble. There we go. Now this layer we want to make sure dries really well, because when we're going to come back over, we don't want it mixing at all. We want the next coat to sit on top of that burnt umber. So I'm going to let this sit for a while, and again, if I were painting multiple pieces of terrain at once, I'd set this aside, move on with the dark brown for the next piece, and keep doing that for successive pieces until the time that I get back around to this piece, everything's dry, and I'm ready to use the next layer. Now that the burnt umber has dried, here I've switched to a 1-inch chip brush just to show you that that works just as well. I'm going to use this autumn brown and do the same thing that I did before when I did the gray. Again, I'm just trying to hit the brown spots, and I am just trying to hit the tips of it. I don't want to get down too deep. Apologies for the bad editing there. My memory card filled up. It's important at this stage to make sure that you're not getting the extra paint onto areas that you've already painted. And that's where sometimes having things a little more gray, kind of spilling out into the rubble, helps some, because then you don't have to go back in and really try to fine-tune those extra places in there. You don't have to get a fine paintbrush out and try to get everything exact. Again, my philosophy is that when it comes to it, speed is where it's at in painting terrain. I'm going to go in and get some of these areas of the nooks and crannies where I did end up going with the brown. Oops. And that is pretty good. Once this dries, if you're happy with it at this level, then you could go ahead and move on to flocking, or you can add on a next layer of paint if you want to. I like to add in not white at this point, but a little bit of the trail tan, and it depends on how I'm feeling in the day. I'm going to mix this with a little bit of the burnt autumn, or I'm sorry, of the autumn brown. And then this can be done just as a very slight dry brush on the top to bring out some of that extra detail of all the soil and earth. A little more. And here I didn't wait for it to dry much because the paint wasn't honestly that thick, so it's going to dry fairly quickly. I've done all of these in gray with brown earth and like grass and that sort of stuff. You could just as easily do like a terracotta for the stone, like a sandstone kind of thing, and then do like yellow sand. Can make a pretty striking looking piece of terrain. We could use any variety of kind of combinations, whatever fits your gaming board. Alright, so at this point the paint is done. It didn't take very long at all to paint this, and if I were batch painting these, then I wouldn't just have this one piece done, but I'd have a whole host of pieces done as well. I'd have a whole batch done at once. Once you've got things painted up, then you could leave it as is at this point in time, or what I like to do is add some sort of static grass or grass tufts or some sort of extra basing to help make it fit in with the rest of the battlefield. Though, of course, if what you had was a brown earth battlefield, then this would be ready to go at that point in time. For static grass, I'm a fan of whatever is cheapest. It can get pretty expensive if you buy it in those little Tupperware type containers. I get mine by the half gallon. This is the late summer. And then I've also become a really big fan of the, I believe it's pronounced silflor. They're kind of grass tufts. These are their late summer buffalo grass. And these consist of these little kind of pre-made tufts of static grass that you can peel off and with tweezers and glue on. So while all the pieces I made for the Kickstarter started like this, they later turned out like this when you added, after I added static grass and those grass tufts. You could of course add other things as well. I could take this and add some snow effects if I wanted, if I'm playing Frostgrave or something like that, or if I want an Arctic board. Whatever best suits the rest of your game table, or whatever fits your army. I hope this has been helpful. Painting terrain is one of those things that I feel is very, very easy, but it's a lot of fun and it's really rewarding. Again, it's great to be able to sit down in an evening and do some work and then end up with the tables full of terrain afterwards, as long as you focus on keeping things as simple as possible. Thanks again so much for your support. If you have any questions at all, please let me know.